This is the Racial Equity Committee, and we are committed to giving you guys information, a space to voice your opinions, um, also to educate you on the issue of systemic racism, racial equity, and the different things that you hear about and you see on TV daily, from the tragedies to the happy. And I do stress both. We are inundated with a lot of tragedy, a lot of negativity, and I think it's important that you know what you're looking at, whether it's positive or negative, but especially when it's negative, so you can start to define it for yourselves and make it make sense. This is workshop number 3. This is part 2 of our voting presentation. Last month, we talked about how to register to vote. We touched a little bit on why it's important to vote. This week, we're talking about your voting rights and what that means and what that has meant over the time before you and during you and after you. Why is it important? As always, we try to keep this varied. We have a very special guest. His name is Diallo Brooks, and I'll come back to him later to talk to us about your voting rights and voting suppression and various things that are going on in our country right now that matter to you. Like I said, it's, my thing is it's your civic duty. It's your duty as a citizen. It's your voice. As you watch people protest and fuss and fight, just know that voting is the actionable part of this thing. Our history is filled with what it is filled with fighting for your right to vote. But before I dive into that, what we're going to do right now is show you guys a video that we have prepared for you last month, and now we got it up and running. So we're going to run that for you and let you guys see your fellow student athletes, tell you a little bit more about why you should vote.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're staying safe and healthy during these difficult times. My name is Drew Atherton. I'm a pitcher for the Cal Poly Pomona baseball team, and I'm here to talk about why it's important to vote and why voting is something to be proud of. Voter apathy, or the lack of interest in participating in elections, is something that occurs in almost every election cycle. In 2016, 4 out of 10 Americans who were eligible to vote did not vote. Voting is an essential building block for our democracy. People may argue that your one vote doesn't matter, which may be true in the case that it might not sway the results of an election. But by voting, you help bring to light issues that you and your fellow citizens care about. It gives average people the power to choose who we want acting on our behalf. It gives people a voice to be heard. This voice is something every American should be proud of. There are countries in the world where the only method of bringing about change is through revolts, violence, or in worst case scenarios, war. But in America, it is our votes that can dictate the path of our country. Therefore, it's not just important that we vote, but I urge all the eligible voters out there to be proud that they voted.
Okay, hi, I'm Imani Williams. I'm on the women's track and field team at CPP, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about women's suffrage. So the women's suffrage movement was created to basically fight against the oppression that women were currently facing at the time. They're specifically fighting, to be equal to men, to be seen as equal to men, but also specifically for the right to vote. So after decades of protests and failed legislation, they actually had a huge victory when the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, where they gained the right to vote, and that amendment basically stated that no state could deny a citizen the right to vote on the basis of sex. And so this whole entire movement was extremely influential in U.S. history, and it is also seen as like a turning point in gender equality in our country. But what some people don't know about the movement is that it actually kind of turned a blind eye to racism, and while white women were now given a clear path to vote, Black women and other women of color still were being barred from exercising that right. And so states did this by creating discriminatory voting practices like poll taxes, literary tests that you had to take before you were able to vote. And this was clearly made to keep people of color and minority groups from actually voting. And so in response to this, Black women suffrage leaders like Mary Church Terrell, Nancy Burroughs, they led a new suffrage campaign where they wanted to show that they deserve the same exact rights that white women were just granted. And so after 45 years of fighting, it wasn't until 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was passed where all women of color were now truly able to exercise their right to vote. And so like I mentioned all of this to kind of just emphasize how important it is that we do vote and how powerful it can really be. Because a lot of opposing groups have and are still fighting against people to vote, whether it be because of their race, because of their gender, because they even have like opposing views. And so it just shows how they know how big of a difference that we can make. And so I know that a lot of us don't like have a huge platform to speak our opinions and, you know, voice everything that we're thinking, but the most proactive way that we can do that right now is by voting. So please use all the information you got today from the meeting and go register to vote.
Hi, my name is Jasper Winslow, and I'm an incoming freshman on the soccer team here at Cal Poly. And today I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about first-time voting. As a first-time voter myself, I understand that beginning the process can be a little overwhelming, whether it's figuring out how to register or trying to decipher complicated ballots and propositions. We're here to guide you. I know one of the biggest challenges facing first-time voters is a lack of resources regarding what will be on the ballot and how that affects you. Even this year, although many of you will have already made up your mind on who you will support in the presidential election, there are other measures that will be on the California ballot you cast that could greatly affect your communities. Propositions involving public school funding, stem cell research, and rent control will all be on this year's ballot in California, yet I know that many of us haven't heard anything about it. Throughout these workshops, we want to provide you with the resources you need to be able to make confident and informed decisions at the polls. Whether it be websites or local grassroots organizations, we want to illustrate that there is no shortage of information or ways to get involved at your disposal in the world today. Another issue I often see in my peers, and something I've felt myself at times, is a sense of complacency or skepticism regarding voting. I hear questions such as, does my vote even matter, or why should I vote? And questions like these are reasonable to ask, and I've asked them myself, but these sentiments left unchecked can be extremely damaging to our democracy. First-time voters and young voters in general make up an increasingly large percentage of eligible voters in the United States, and they have the potential to sway elections all the way up to a national level. However, these groups have continued to produce disappointingly low turnouts at the polls. In 2014, less than 20% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 exercised their right to vote. That's millions of votes gone missing that have the potential to shape local policy or even the course of the nation as a whole for the next 4 years. Knowing us young folk in America have the power to enact so much change should be proof alone that your vote really does matter. So take the time now to register and take steps towards being a first-time voter if you haven't already. And don't just stop there. We're all athletes here, so I know you've had a coach or a mentor at some point who's spoken to you about building great habits, and this is no different. As a first-time voter, you want to be building great voting habits, such as staying informed on what will be on your ballots, knowing where your local polling places are, and ultimately exercising your right to vote at every opportunity possible. Remember, this may be your first time voting, but we want to build these habits so that it isn't your last.
Hi, my name is William Shavern. I play basketball at Cal Poly Pomona for the men's team, and I was asked to talk about Black suffrage. Black suffrage refers to Black people's right to vote. Slavery is not abolished until the Black man has the ballot. Frederick Douglass said this in May 1865. It was not until the 15th Amendment was passed in 1869 that Black men were allowed to vote. Even with that amendment being passed, the Black voter faced obstacles like poll taxes, literacy tests, and other measurements to keep them from exercising their voting right. This continued all the way until the 24th Amendment in 1964, which eliminated the poll tax, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which ended Jim Crow laws. Fast forward to 2020, and people are deciding not to vote simply because they think it is not important. Their vote doesn't matter, and it has no effect on their life. If your vote did not matter, then President Obama would not have been the first Black president to run for 2 terms in a row. Black Americans still encounter systemic barriers to equally exercise their voting rights today. For example, a voting rights activist named Latasha Brown said she waited 3 hours to vote at her polling station in South Atlanta. The scene there, she said, was far different from the primarily white polling station on the northern side of her city, when she went to meet somebody there to go vote. This is just one example set in place for Black voters to be less encouraged to go out and vote. Answer this question for me. If voting was not important and had no effect on you, then why did they put all these obstacles up in order to keep you from voting? Thank you.
I even like that, and that's like the 5th time I've seen it. I hope that helped you guys understand why we're doing this. And Will's part is a perfect segue into our next section. We're going to dive a little deeper this workshop into the things that he touched on about the historical context of voting rights. First up with that will be Coach Blue, will be followed by Jaja, Lauren, and Jenny.
Good evening, Broncos. This is Coach Blue here. I hope you guys are ready for a very insightful night, informational night. So I'll go ahead and share a little bit about what I'll be talking about when it comes to voters' rights and suppression history. So in 1869, the 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. And in the 1920s, women were able to vote, except for Black women in certain southern areas. This was a breakthrough to the African American community, but many white supremacists did not like the idea of African Americans voting because of the power it could potentially give them. So they found ways to suppress the Black vote. So let me tell you a story about a Black United States war veteran who just returned home from fighting for our country in World War II, which he believed would help him gain freedom for his own country. Maceo Snipes decided to go and vote, and he was the only Black man who voted during this election because of voter intimidation that was going on during this time. Once they found out that he voted, when I say they, I'm talking about the white supremacy, or the white supremacists, I would say. 4 white men showed up at his front door, and 2 of them were later identified as World War II veterans. They called him outside to the front door and they confronted him, and then ended up shooting him in his back and left him for dead. Once he was left for dead, Maceo Snipes' mother discovered him, and they had to walk 3 miles to get to the hospital. This hospital was a Jim Crow hospital, so it did not prioritize Black lives. So he waited 6 hours before he could be seen. And once he was seen, it was found that he needed a blood transfusion, and the hospital told him that they couldn't accommodate him because they didn't have any Black blood. And 2 days later, he died. This was just one of the examples of voter suppression during the time. And certain states implemented poll taxes for voter registration, which affected the African American community because many could not afford these poll taxes. And they also imposed a literacy test for voters to register, which many Black people during that time were illiterate because of the poor education system in their communities. So this things affect them. They went from thinking they can vote to, which they could, but they used ways and found ways to stop them. Like if you want to vote, well, you're going to have to take this test. And if you can't pass the test, then basically you can't vote. Or if you want to vote, you're going to have to pay this tax. But if you don't have the money, you can't vote. You can't register to vote. But years later, through protests, activism, blood, sweat, and tears, more progress was made, and the 24th Amendment was passed, which prohibited both Congress and the states from conditioning the right to vote in federal elections on the payment of poll taxes and other types of taxes. Shortly after that, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law on August 6, 1965, with Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders. This act banned the use of literacy tests and provided federal oversight for voter registration areas with less than 50% of non-white population to vote. By the end of 1965, once they got the right to vote, over 250,000 new Black voters were registered to vote. But the voter suppression still continued. And Coach Jaja is going to go ahead and expand upon that.
So if we push forward, right, for a period of time, we felt like, yeah, we're making strides. We're doing great. We've got a Black president. Racism doesn't exist. But in 2011, the voters' suppression was on the rise. They started implementing very strict photo ID legislation, making it difficult for people to vote without a photo ID. And for us in California, it's not a big deal, right? Everyone has an ID. But truth be told, getting a photo ID is a process in itself. And that's one of the ways that they continued to attempt to take down the number of minority groups and their abilities to vote. In 2011, it was a record number of restrictions. So it wasn't still here, it increased as almost as if it was a response to the progressive change that had actually happened. So when we go to the polls this year, or when we hear someone say, we don't need the Voting Rights Act anymore, racism doesn't exist, remind them of 2011, when we felt like we had some changes and we were making some strides, and the voting suppression actually took off and increased. Other means of voter suppression were restrictions to voter registration. There were a lot of penalties that were extremely harsh for those who were trying to help other people get registered. Things like reporting the registration information within 48 hours, when it used to be 10 days. Entire organizations stopped their actual purpose. They stopped doing what they set out to do because of these harsh penalties that really ran rampant during that time. And also during this time, there was a lot of states who were adding more and more legislature to their voting policies to permit people from voting, not only in rural areas, but even places like California. Most of these states that are still covered in the Voting Rights Act were continually trying to discriminate from the beginning up until now. And I know that you guys, given social media, there's a lot of talk about voter suppression during this time. And it is important that we look to the past to recognize what has been done before, so we can locate we can identify what is happening now. Lauren Salas will talk about a specific instance where in recent times in 2018, where that has occurred.
Hi, everyone. So I want to take a moment to share a present day example that some of you may be familiar with. So in 2018, there was a tight race for Georgia governor between then Secretary of State Brian Kemp and challenger Stacey Abrams. If Stacey Abrams was elected, she would be the first Black female governor to hold office in the United States. Brian Kemp's office was also responsible for regulating voter laws in the state of Georgia, which some saw as a conflict of interest. Several accusations of voter suppression arose. The following are a few examples of how voter suppression may have affected this election. Between 2016 and 2018, about 1.5 million, close to 10% of voters were purged from the voter rolls. Many did not know that they had even been purged from records until they showed up to vote. Georgia also had closed nearly 214 polling places and cut back on early voting. They used an exact match system in which an individual's name on the voter registration forms had to exactly match other state databases, or they were denied a vote. The exact match can include something as little as a missing hyphen or an apostrophe from a name, and oftentimes could result from a typo when a worker input the name into the database. For more information on voter suppression in the 2018 Georgia governor race, Stacey Abrams has released a documentary recently titled All In, The Fight for Democracy. This can be found on Amazon Prime. And now I will pass it to Jenny.
Gotta remember to unmute. So hi everyone, Jenny here. I hope you all enjoyed the information and history of voting rights in America. When talking about your voting rights, inevitably we must talk about voter suppression. Voter suppression exists to suppress votes which disproportionately affect African Americans and Latinos. It's important to understand that democracy works best when as many people in this country from all walks of life are able to participate. When voter suppression exists, these individuals lose their voice and the opportunity to make changes that affect their lives. There are many ways voter suppression exists, and it usually affects a group's societally imposed characteristics, such as poverty or education. So whether we are talking about voter ID laws, closing poll places, prohibiting voting by mail, which is a hot button issue right now in California, locking mailboxes, shutting down the U.S. Postal Service, or even intimidation factors, such as the story of Maceo Snipes that you heard earlier. Voter suppression is real. If you would like to learn more about voter suppression, how it exists, or if you feel like your voting rights are being suppressed, we'll be dropping some links in the chat to some great websites and podcasts so that you can learn more. If you still can't find a good reason to vote, vote because there were many others like Maceo Snipes that died trying, and many more whose rights are currently violated and were not able to vote. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Jaja. Thanks, everybody, for sharing those stories. As we move forward to bring this all home, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. His name is Diallo Brooks. He's a former collegiate student athlete, played basketball back east. He's now the Senior Director of Outreach and Public Engagement for the People for the American Way. He has been an activist and an author for social justice, advocating for and ensuring the rights and justice and equity for all people. He will share with you some of his experiences and knowledge from the front lines. He's actually been one of the people you've seen out there on the megaphone, leading protests and activism. And hopefully his information can help you better understand your voting rights and what it means. Diallo, welcome to the Racial Equity Workshop. We'd like to thank you for joining us, and the stage is yours.
So first of all, thank you very, very much for inviting me to participate. It's always exciting to have these conversations, and all the stuff that you all already talked about hits the nail on the head. I think that, you know, for me doing this work for as long as I've done it, to see a group that is working together on campus, but also probably beyond campus to impact your communities around racial justice, around social justice, around voting is so very impressive, because oftentimes we hear a lot of stories about how folks are not able to come together to have the important conversations around creating change and leveraging power. So, I mean, it's really, really exciting. I mean, I tell you, it gives me a boost, given the work that I do on a daily basis, to see that you all have taken the time to put this together and be really thoughtful about this. I really commend you all for doing it, because not everybody is doing this. So thank you. Just really briefly, just a little bit about me. I work for the People for the American Way. It's an organization that was founded by Norman Lear, who is a TV producer, and Norman lives out in California. He's 90-something years old, but he did all those shows. They're kind of old shows, so most of y'all might not even know them. But All in the Family, good time. It's funny because I'm at the point in my life where I can say, like, wow, like, I'm not young folk no more, right? But like All in the Family, Good Times, Sanford and Son, so many of the Jeffersons, so many of those shows that he produced. And so he started People for the American Way with like Barbara Jordan, former Congresswoman, and others, to really push back kind of against some extreme right voices that were really, you know, attacking him about bringing up controversial issues in the media, in his medium. The topics that he was covering weren't topics you typically saw, dealing with poverty in the inner city, dealing with racial issues, dealing with even gender and sexuality issues. All of that he was addressing in his shows through comedy. And so there was a lot of folks that were a little upset with that. And so he wanted an organization to kind of fight back against that. So fast forward to now, we just got a new president of our organization a few months ago, Ben Jealous. Ben Jealous some of you may know, was the Democratic nominee for governor from Maryland, and had a close race there. He's very good friends with Stacey Abrams. And also in a previous life before that, he was the president of the NAACP. And so he's the first Black president of People for the American Way. So he's come in to run this organization, has pushed us forward to be really aggressive as we really work around racial justice, but also justice for every community everywhere. The topic of voting, just to date myself, I'm 48 years old. I've been doing this work for 25 plus years. I was a political science major in college. I was a basketball player in college. And it was very interesting for me as a student athlete because I was always into the kind of political social justice space early on. Went into school and not everybody was there with me on that. And so it was a process of educating folks and just working with my peers to help uplift the importance of voting. Voter suppression, the right to vote, has been something that generations have fought for. Women have fought for it. Black folks have fought for it. Immigrant communities have fought for it. So many different communities have done the hard work to prepare us for this moment right now. So many communities have given themselves and sacrificed themselves so we all can vote. Now, sometimes the history is lost on us because we say that's something in the past, that's not something that's relatable to now, so we have to focus in on now. Every movement of change was created by young people. You didn't see a bunch of old folks in the street running around protesting, pushing for change. You saw young people that saw their rights under attack. They knew what they wanted, had the courage to go fight for it. And so voting is an exercise of power. It is not the end all be all. Voting is not something that you wake up in the morning, you voted and you changed everything. Voting is a part of a civic process that we have to start flexing that muscle memory around in order to create change. I'm gonna tell you, I work with a lot of political folks, and I tell you, and they'll tell you why it's important. Because when they start pulling lists of places that they go talk to, when they start looking at who they engage, who they do outreach to, and who they cater to, they look at communities that vote. If your community doesn't vote much, they pay little attention to you because they don't have time in their political cycle. So that helps you to understand that just exercising your right to vote creates power. But also breaking down barriers so more folks participate in this democracy. This country doesn't work well when folks are on the sidelines, when folks are marginalized and kept out of the ability to participate in voting. I have a good friend of mine in Florida that was running a campaign in Florida. It's Amendment 4 campaign, which allows those with felony convictions to be and have served their time to be able to restore their right to vote. Because in certain places, you get a felony conviction, you can't vote again, and they have to restore that right. And this friend of mine runs an organization in Florida, and he is a former felon himself. And now, fast forward, felon had drug issues earlier in his life, was convicted, went to jail, got out, got his law degree, and has been a social justice advocate ever since, and running a huge multi-million-dollar organization in the state of Florida trying to restore the right to vote. You know why? Because he understands what it feels like not to be able to exercise that power, not to be able to have a voice. Those of us that have the power have to exercise that power, not only for ourselves, but for our communities. And we also have to do the hard work of breaking down the barriers for other folks that have been marginalized in the process. And that's why, looking at the screen, and I scrolled through the different pages to try to see as many people as I could, to see that there's multiple racial groups represented, because in order to create change, we need everybody at the table. We need everybody to participate. We need everybody to exercise that right, but also help break down barriers for those that sit next to us that have obstacles in the way. One thing to know why voting is important is that folks are trying to take away the right to vote for a lot of folks. Young people have been attacked around voting. They've done work around the country where they've eliminated polling places on campuses to make it convenient for students to vote. When they've passed voter ID laws, and that was mentioned in one of the segments before, sometimes in some places they were excluding student IDs, right? And now we're in this COVID situation where, you know, folks are more at home. And so more folks are probably, particularly younger folks, are probably less likely to get a driver's license, because if you're staying at home and you're doing everything virtually or you're not moving around as much, there's not a need for a driver's license. And so you can see where the rubber hits the road, where it creates obstacles for communities that look just like you all on the screen. And so if people are working that hard to make it difficult for you to vote, moving polling places, closing down polling places, limiting the DMV hours, so it makes it harder for folks to even go to the DMV to get the kind of ID that they need to be able to vote in certain places, you know it means something to somebody. I'm not on here to tell you who to vote for or how to do that, to go about that process. You all should do your own research and make up your own mind, but also go in with a plan. Voting can't happen, particularly now in this COVID environment, if you haven't created a plan. Are you going to vote by mail, if that's an option? Are you going to go early vote? Is that an option? Are you going to call your friends and say, hey, we're going to go together and vote? It's not enough to just register and sit at home. Registering is great, but if you don't go to the ballot box, then your registration doesn't really mean that much. And it's an opportunity for you to exercise your voices. It's an opportunity for you to mobilize your community to break down barriers. Our system works when we have more people at the table, a part of the conversations to create real change. You have to do the hard work. It's not something that's just going to be given to you. But the more that you're able to exercise your right to vote, the more that you're able to help other folks around you exercise that right to vote, the better our society will be. The more inclusive our society will be. Because our democracy functions much, much better when we have multiple voices and multiple perspectives. Remember, when y'all were going through the history, groups were left out. There are groups on this call that would not be able to vote in the past. Black folks weren't able to vote. Women were not able to vote. Pretty much if you weren't a white male landowner early on, you were not allowed to vote. So if you look across the screen, if you look up and down, you look at the folks next to you and you know the folks that you play with on the team, some of those folks would not be able to vote in the past. And so there was a fight to create a space for everyone to have a voice. I see Coach Smith has the image of John Lewis behind him, who just recently passed away. Spent his life fighting for the right to vote, protecting the right to vote. And so that should mean something to each and every one of us as we do this work. We don't all have to be in the same exact place politically all the time. But we do have to create spaces where we open up opportunities for us to have the kind of conversations that create real change. Young people are the leaders. You all are the future. And I know y'all hear that. I know that's kind of cliche. You know, I have a 19-year-old son that's in college back east here. And so I understand that cliche is like, you all are the future. You all get to change everything, right? But it really does mean something, because when young people stand up, you see change created. If you look at all the protest movement, and I know this is around racial justice that you're convening around, if you look at the streets, I have the Black Lives Matter Plaza here in DC behind me. If you look at the streets, it's young people, and it's a diverse set of young people that are standing up. That is civic engagement. voting and activism goes together. They're not separate pieces. You don't just go out to the street and march and not vote, but you also don't just vote and not hold folks accountable. You have an agenda. And, you know, if you look at elections, I wrote a couple of things down that, you know, I was thinking about, like, what's important to you? Is your healthcare important to you? Are criminal justice issues important to you? Are jobs important to you? Like, you all will be, you know, some of you all may be freshmen, but in a few years you'll be graduating and looking for that job, right? Are those available to you? Are the politicians that were elected working to make sure that they create a space for you, an economy for you, to be able to be employed and be able to take care of yourself and your families, right? Are those things available? Those are things that you vote on, and those are the things you hold elected officials accountable for. And one resource that I didn't share with you, and when I talked about being prepared, there's an organization called the League of Women Voters. It's a national organization, and they have a resource guide called Vote 411. I'll put it in the chat in a second. But Vote 411 really kind of just walks you through everything you need to know about the voting process in a way. And some of the other links that I shared the other day with the team have some of that in it as well. But they do a good job of really engaging around all the things you need to just know about voting, to make it simple, to make it easy. I mean, I understand when you're a first-time voter, it's a little bit of an intimidating process. Like, who's on the ballot? What am I voting for? And the last thing I really want to leave you with before, because I really want to have some dialogue, I don't want to just lecture to you all, is that voting is something that you should think about as a community. Voting shouldn't be an isolated event. And voting is not just in the presidential cycle thing to do. The most important people that impact your lives are your city council folks, your school board members, your state legislators, the folks that are on the ground that are closest to the policies that impact your lives. The ones that make decisions about whether you're, you know, how much funding you're able to get for school, right? The ones that are making the decisions about the roads in front of your house. The ones that helping to make, you know, working with your chancellor at your university, working with whether your school is open or closed, right? Like, all those types of decisions, those decisions are not made in isolation. Your chancellor's not making that decision by themselves. Your school functions in a locality that has made other plans about how that locality is going to function. And so those politicians are making decisions about your lives every single day. And no matter what community you're in, you know, whether you're getting the access to the healthcare you need, or you're getting the support that you need, whether there's mental health services available in your community when you need it. Because, hey, you know, I've been a student athlete. I know sometimes that there are those days that you need a little bit of, you know, coaching on that side, right? And so it's just really exercising and utilizing your voice. If you don't know, don't be afraid to ask. One of the great things, like I said, about this group here is that you have a cohort of folks that are looking to work together to create change, that are there to answer questions for you, there to support you, there to help you. One of the greatest things about coaches, like I had a great relationship with all of my coaches, particularly I had 2 coaches in college at different points. But just being able to go into their office and talk about not only basketball at the time, but life in general. And so life in general are also these things like voting. Like, hey, I'm not sure how to do this. I'm a little bit nervous about going about this process. What else do I need to know? And they've set up a structure where they're educating themselves as well to make sure that you all have the tools you need to be successful around this, to create real change. And so I'm just going to end on that note, and, you know, allow some time for questions. Like I said, you know, voting is part of civic engagement. Voting is just one pillar of that. It's something that, like, every one of us should just feel like we have to do. we have to exercise our voice, because they're not counting on y'all turning out. I'm in a lot of meetings where the folks is like, yeah, these young folks, man, they're not turning out. I said, well, people turn 18 every year. Like, there's new folks coming into voting every year. So you can't expect folks that haven't done this much to know everything about it, right? And, you know, senior citizens, you know, they've been voting all their lives. You know, they fought for the right to vote. They've been voting all their lives. But young folks is new. It's a new experience. So we have to support young people in that exercise, but also be able to follow young people's lead. You know, y'all know what y'all need. Y'all know what y'all want. Y'all know what's important in your lives. And we have to be able to listen to you so we can help with that process. So I'll turn it over for questions or however the program's going to flow.
No, definitely want you to take some questions before we launch into that. First of all, thank you. On a personal note, everything you said and shared, I appreciate you sharing the way you shared it, because I think it's important that young people, as you pointed out, are given the bones of it rather than the meat all the time. People always want to give young people the meat and never want to give them the framework of it so they even understand what they're listening to or digesting or being told. So yeah, man, everything you said, I'm excited. You made me feel like I want to vote today. But before we launch into, we do have some questions that we collected before we came in, and we'll have some athletes ask those to you. But to everybody listening right now, student athletes, we're gonna post a survey in the chat. Please click on that and answer it now as you're listening and/or as you're listening to the Q&A with Diallo. So please, that'll be posted shortly. Click on the link, take the survey. It helps us out a lot as we move forward through these workshops and future workshops. Yeah, so go ahead and do that. That just got posted by Clarissa. So go ahead and click on that. And then we'll segue into some of the questions with our remaining time. First up, we got a few questions from volleyball, and we'll have Colleen Kennedy shoot some bullets at you, see what you got. Go ahead, Colleen.
Hi, I'm Colleen. I'm with the women's volleyball team. Our question was, what are some potential consequences of not voting?
Well, consequences of not voting is that one big consequence is your voice is not heard. You don't get a chance to weigh in on decisions around who gets elected to represent you. So basically, you leave that decision to somebody else. You leave the decision about everything that impacts your life that voting is connected to other people. You know, I look at voting as like a resource or like as money. You know what I'm saying? If you have an opportunity, it's your money. You decide on how you're going to use that money, right? But if I have a pot of money in my hand, I'm not going to just have it out here for somebody else to take it out of my hand and use it however they want without me having to say so. That to me is like sitting out on the sideline. Is like you have an opportunity, you have a resource in your hand that you let somebody take away from you and utilize however they want to without your input, without you even being engaged in that conversation. And you know, I don't know about y'all, but I just don't have money like that just to be, you know, thrown away. I don't have resources like that I just want to throw away and say, okay, you know, Coach Lawson can make all the decisions for my life. You know, at some point we got to step up to the plate and make the decision.
For sure. Thank you, Colleen. Thanks for the answer. Next up, men's basketball. B Money.
Hello, how you doing?
I'm good. How you doing?
I'm good. Okay, so one question I have is, to what degree does voter suppression impact the outcome of an election?
Oh, it can have a tremendous impact. I think they mentioned the Stacey Abrams situation in Georgia. A lot of these elections recently have been coming down to very few votes.
Okay.
In big elections, there's maybe thousands. In smaller elections, it could be 2 votes, 5 votes. And so anytime that there's a suppression tactic that eliminates a person from participating, that has an impact on the election. You know, if you really think about it, you know, if you go and the polling place is not open and you just say, hey, I'm not going to vote, or somebody mails you some information and says the election is on Thursday instead of on Tuesday, on that Tuesday, and you don't vote, and that election came down to 1 or 2 votes, that's going to be problematic.
Okay, that makes sense.
Just simple as that. Cool. Next up, y'all I got for you is track and field, Imani Williams.
Hi. In 2013, the Supreme Court made a ruling that parts of the 15th Amendment were ruled unconstitutional. And I was wondering, I think the case was Shelby v. County.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how big of an effect that had on like states actually creating voter oppression, and if that kind of made it even easier for them to do so.
Oh, it definitely did. Because so what you're referring to is the Voting Rights Act, and excuse my dog from barking. Somebody
He's had enough.
But yeah, he's the boss. It was the Voting Rights Act that they struck down parts, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and I'm not gonna get into the weeds of that. But what it did, it has allowed states around the country to not to be checked around some of the voting laws that they put in place. Because basically what the Voting Rights Act did is it created a pre-clearance for a bunch of states, where those states had to go, and if they implemented a new law, say if they say, okay, we want voter ID laws, or we want to change polling places, we wanted to limit polling places or close down, you know, early voting or whatever it is they wanted to do, they would have to get pre-clearance in order to do that. And so somebody would have to check to make sure that they weren't suppressing votes in that particular area if it had a disproportionate impact on communities of color. And so when they got rid of that provision, it opened up the floodgates for states to kind of have carte blanche to do what they wanted in those states around voting. And so it was a huge blow. You saw a bunch of states implement voter ID laws around the country. You saw a bunch of states closing down polling locations, and in heavily minority communities, heavily poor communities, and you know, on campuses. And so yeah, it did have a huge impact.
Well, I learn something new every day. Baseball, Drew, the man who found you.
Drew.
Hello. My question was, how do I know my vote's going to count this year? I mean, especially with all the new kind of restrictions against polling places, and how did you answer that question for yourself? How do you know that your vote is going to be counted?
Well, first of all, I mentioned at the top of my presentation is that you need to have a plan around voting. And so you got all these resources, they collected all this information, you know how to go in and find out when the deadlines are for everything. Like that Vote 411 I just sent in the chat has everything. You can pull up everything. League of Women Voters, they've been around for a while, nonpartisan, they do a great job at that. If you have a plan and you execute that plan early, your vote, you know your vote will count. If you wait to the last minute and you get into trouble at the last minute, then it becomes a lot more difficult. I gave another resource about an election protection hotline. There's a hotline that you can call if you have a problem. My thing is, and I tell everybody, whether it's young folks or any community, is avoid having to cast a provisional ballot because you waited to the last minute. Because a provisional ballot is less likely to count because they got to make a determination whether that ballot is approved. But if you check your registration, you know whether you're voting by mail or voting early, you know where your polling place is, you verified everything, then you know your vote is going to count when you show up to exercise that right. And once you get in line to vote, nobody's to tell you you can't vote. If you're in line before the polling place closes, I don't care if the line is 5 blocks long. I don't care if it takes you to the next day to go through that line. Once you're in that line, you have the right to vote, and don't let anybody tell you you can't. And if you all have cell phones, there's an election protection hotline of people harassing you, telling you you shouldn't be here. You get on that hotline, it's 1-866-OUR-VOTE. You call that hotline and say, yo, folks are out here trying to stop me from voting. I need help. They have lawyers at polling places all over the country. It's multiple organizations that are part of this stuff. And they will do whatever they can to make sure that they help you in that situation. So, like I said, just be prepared. If you it's like practice. You know, if you don't practice, you're not going to perform right in the game. You know, there's only a couple people that could not practice. Maybe Allen Iverson, I don't know. But you got to practice. And so it's really the preparation, and then do it as a community. Get other folks with you, because then you feel safer and stronger and more powerful when you exercise that right.
Yeah, bingo. To add to that, I think it's important to know, Diallo, you might not even be aware of this, but all CSUs, last time I checked, all CSU campuses will be polling places.
Oh, that's
so
great.
Any of you guys that are around campus, I know everybody isn't, but if you're around campus, you can vote at Kellogg Arena. Kellogg Arena will be a polling place. We don't have a lot of details on it yet, but the minute we do, it'll be disseminated to the campus, whether or not you want to volunteer, what the hours of that are. And I really want to illustrate the point of preparing to vote. Voting is not difficult, but you want to make sure that your vote is counted and prepared for it, as Diallo has said, which means now.
Exactly.
Next up is women's basketball. Rebecca Islas?
Islas.
Islas. Okay.
Yes. Hi. My question is, how can we prevent populations with fewer resources from being influenced by fake news and misinformation?
Oh, that's a great question. So, you know, social media, all of that stuff is, you know, you're seeing a whole proliferation of fake news, and not the fake news that other guys talk about, but fake news, real fake news. Check the source of the information that you're getting, right? Make sure that it's from a reputable source, a reputable entity that has a history of sending out reputable information. And that's why I gave the team some resources that you all can use. Like, once again, you have the Vote 411, the League of Women Voters. They're a reputable source. You can go in, you can find your polling place, you can find what's on the ballot. They give you kind of a straight arrow shot of what's on the ballot, where you are. The Washington Post piece that I sent out as well, there's a tool on there where you can pull up your state, and it gives you all the ballot information that you need to know, and places that you can go to check your status. And so just hyper focus in on the things that you know to be true, and let all that other ancillary stuff kind of float off to the side. But also be a good teammate, and make sure that if you see friends and family members sharing information that you know not to be true, to check them. I mean, I check my own family members because they're getting stuff. I even have, you know, older folks in my family that are not used to social media, so they just see us like, is this true? I'm like, no, that's not true. Check, you know, official government websites and other places that have official information to make sure that you're on point. Don't let them hit you with the okie doke.
Man, preach, golly. Boy. Next up, men's soccer. Sorry, I got distracted. Matt, I'm sorry, it's in my email. I forgot who's asking the men's soccer's question.
It was gonna be me.
There you go, Jasper.
So our question was, how do voter ID laws lead to voter suppression in underrepresented areas?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So, like I mentioned before, voter ID laws, it's a funny thing because on the surface, it feels like, hey, everybody should have an ID or be able to get an ID. That's like a no-brainer. That's part of their strategy in utilizing voter ID as a suppression tool. There are a bunch of communities, marginalized communities, that one, you have older folks that don't have IDs because they haven't needed IDs. You have certain communities that don't have low levels of even getting IDs for driver's license because they don't have access to vehicles, so they don't drive. You have you have community, you have folks that get married and they change their last name and they don't change it on their driver's license. And so they have problems at the polls around that. You have so many different communities that are impacted because of various nuances in the way the IDs. You have students in certain places that are impacted because they don't allow student IDs. And so like if your only form of ID is your student ID, and the other IDs that are listed are, you know, not available to you, you have to go out. And also the other piece around IDs is also IDs cost money. So if you're poor and you're making a decision about whether you're gonna eat or get an ID, you're gonna figure out how to eat first and then get an ID. So as you look at more marginalized communities, and this is of all races, you know, not just Black folks, but all races, you can see a swath of folks that just don't have IDs.
Yeah, for sure. Last but not least, women's soccer. Taylor Scott, what you got?
Hi, our question is, what's the difference between mail-in ballots and absentee ballots, and what are your thoughts on them impacting the outcome of the election?
That's a great question. So mail-in ballots in certain places are absentee ballots. So you have to check your local jurisdiction to make sure that you understand, you know, wherever you're voting. If you're voting in California, if you're voting near your campus, or if you're voting in a community where you're from, if you're recruited out of state, know the laws in that particular area around mail-in ballots. Some states, like Colorado is a great example. They've been voting by mail forever, for a long time, where you just get they mail it out to you. I'm here in DC, they're mailing our ballots to us now. So they're sending it automatically. Some states require you to, they're waiving some of the requirements around absentee ballots, where they're letting you have no excuse absentee ballots, meaning you don't have to have an excuse to get an absentee ballot, which allows you to vote by mail. But that's why it's important to check those resources and put your information in to make sure, one, you're registered, and also what is available to you, when the deadlines are, because in certain places there's deadlines to request. Some places where you're getting absentee ballots, you have to sign the absentee ballot and sign the envelope. So if you forget to sign the envelope, your ballot is not valid, right? And so it's really, really, really important. I go back to this again and again, have a plan. You have all the information. Don't keep this information to yourselves. Share it with your friends, your family members, folks that you know, because you all are the change. You all create that wave of momentum where a lot of people get the information that they need that they might not get, because you all have access. So it's a privilege. When you have a privilege, you got to share it with other folks.
Man, thank you. Thank you. Diallo, I want to thank you for coming in, taking the time, sharing that wisdom and information. I hope you guys really appreciate not just what he shared, because what he shared isn't really unique, but how he shared it with you. The things he stressed: have a plan, do your research, the seriousness of it, voting, why it matters. You know, exercising your voice is not to be confused with winning. I think this is an important thing. But if you don't vote, you can't win. That's a fact. That's just, you know,
Definitely.
I think everybody learned their lesson in 2016. You took it for granted. You sat at home. And here we are, mad. Folks upset but didn't vote. But thank you, Diallo. Appreciate you. You can hang around. We're going to kind of close up shop for like 2 seconds and let them get back to their homework, but you're more than welcome to stay and chit chat with us afterwards, because we're a barrel of laughs, as you've already found out. Or if you got to run and take care of the dog or eat dinner, this is your dinner time, you're more than welcome to. Everybody else is here. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you guys for hanging tough. I really sound like the old guy. I'm excited. I sound like my dad. I'm excited. I think I got more from this than anybody else in the room, but I really enjoyed it. I really liked it. I think it hit home for what we're trying to share with you guys in terms of what it means to vote, what the bits and pieces of voting means. Next time, in our third and final part, We will touch on some specific issues and propositions as Diallo illustrated. And one thing I'll remind all of you, we'll never tell you what to vote for, but we'll try to give you some resources so you can look into the things that interest you and matter to you. I think Diallo said something very important in reference to fake news. Hyper focus on the things you know to be true, so you don't get distracted. And like he said, I think it's a good reference point for sports. You listen to your coach tells you something, but this person told you something else on the side. And if you listen to those voices, you get confused. And that's kind of where we are with social media and news these days. You get a lot of noise and a lot of factoids, as they are. But once again, thank you. I hope to see you guys all in a month. Please click on the survey, fill out the survey. The more surveys, the better for us. We're trying to pick topics, making sure this thing reaches you where you are, at your level so you can understand it. So please fill out the survey. It'll take you 5 minutes. I think we only got 5 questions. Click, 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 and send. You don't have to put your name on it. So we'd appreciate it. Other than that, everybody, we return you to your lives. Thank you for participating, and everybody have a good Thursday evening.